We'll start off with question 1. Victor, if you'd like to come up. The question is a simple one. Tell us about yourself and why you chose to run as a candidate for Werriwa and why you chose the Liberal Democrats. Thank you.
All right, so 3 questions there. All right, well, it's nice to see you all here today. My name is Victor Tay. I'm actually a Christian pastor, so I've pastored a church for the last 7 years. I also worked in sales support and continuous improvement for the last 10 years. But unfortunately, not long ago, I lost my job because of the vaccine mandates, and that goes to my reason for why I wanted to run. I was not happy with how the government handled COVID over the last 2.5 years. I felt like, they were spending our children and our grandchildren's futures into oblivion, and also a lot of our freedoms were under attack. So what pushed me over the line was when they closed churches down, being a pastor myself. So that's what got me involved in politics. I wanted to push back on what I felt was an attack on our freedoms. The other thing is I'm a passionate advocate for smaller government and lower taxes. And I felt like the Liberal Democrats was the only party that really seriously is dealing with the spending issues and dealing with the fact that we just pay way too much taxes in our country. We think you guys, Australian citizens, make better decisions about their own money than any politician or bureaucrat would. So the reason why I put my hand up for Werriwa, I wanted to make sure that this area had somebody that stood for these values, that stood for freedom, that stood for smaller government, that stood for smaller government and bigger citizen. So I threw my hat in the ring so there was somebody to stand for these values. Thank you.
Question 2 is, sadly, domestic violence and gambling addiction are 2 significant issues in southwest Sydney. If elected, what do you believe the federal government should do to address these issues in our electorate in relation to what does the UAP propose to do, and what would you do to influence these decisions?
All right, I'd like to say that I don't believe any politician or bureaucrat will be able to solve these sorts of social issues. You know who solves these social issues? It's community groups, right? Churches, religious groups, other community groups. So whenever a politician gets up and says they're going to solve this problem, what they're going to do is they're going to funnel your tax dollars to the organisations of their choosing. Now, I don't know about you, I don't trust politicians to spend our money wisely, right? They don't have a good track record. But you know who I do trust to spend their money wisely? You. You will spend your money a lot better than any politician or bureaucrat ever will, right? So the way I believe the federal government can address issues like this is if we tax citizens less. Right, so the Liberal Democrats have a policy where we want to increase the tax-free threshold to $40,000 and we want to reduce the tax rate to 20%. So if you're on a $40,000 income, that's going to put approximately $4,000 more a year in your pocket. If you're on $80,000 a year, that calculates to about $8,500 more a year. Now, if you had another $8,500 in your pocket, a lot of you may go to this church, you will have so much more money to give to the causes that you believe bring the most value. I don't want that decision in the hand of a politician. Have you heard of the term pork barrelling? Pork barrelling is when they use taxpayer funds for their projects or their things that they, will benefit from politically. But I trust the citizen to make that decision. I want citizens to keep more of their money. Then you can donate to the community groups that you believe are bringing the most value to your community, and that's where the problem gets solved. The problem does not get solved in Canberra with domestic violence and gambling. The problem does not get solved in Macquarie Street. It gets solved when pastors, religious leaders, community groups sit down with people with those problems. And if good citizens like yourself have more money to contribute to those community groups, then they will have more money to deal with these problems. Now, the other thing I think goes towards domestic violence is the cost of living. And again, this ties in with all the debt and spending and regulation and taxation that the government puts on its citizens. If we get government out of the way, government is not normally the solution, it's normally the problem. If we get government out of the way, the politicians out of our pocket, then the citizens will have more money to deal with these social issues like domestic violence and gambling addiction. Thank you.
Number 3, Before the last federal election, the government promised a religious discrimination bill. It's been 3 years. This has not been passed or delivered. In fact, it was a major schmozzle, to say the least. Over 80%, or about 80% of the people in Liverpool identify as people of faith. Many parents choose to send their children to one of the 25 faith-based schools in Werriwa. Many people are involved in numerous places of worship that vary between 20 and 50, depending on what numbers you look for. So the question comes back, do you support the principle that these organisations, religious organisations, should be able to give preference in employment to people who share the same religious belief as the organisations, and should they be able to teach the beliefs in that organisations? The second part to that question is, should Section 38(3) of the Sexual Discrimination Act be withdrawn?
Yeah, so one of the principles of our party is we do believe in freedom. We believe in freedom of religion. And I agree with that. What Adam said, freedom of religion is meant to be a constitutional right. It's one of the few ones that we have in Australia. You know, America has a Bill of Rights where there's several. We do have few. One of them is freedom of religion. So I agree that it's there in the Constitution. The problem is we need politicians that actually respect our Constitution, will actually follow our Constitution, rather than creating this emergency legislation to get around our Constitution. So we have that protection there. The question is, should schools be allowed to discriminate based on, you know, people's religious positions? Of course they should be able to. If you are a religious school, you should be able to hire people that fit your ethos and fit your values. Now, the problem here, we have a policy in our Freedom Manifesto, which is the document, if you grab one at the back table, which is called decentralised education. Now, the problem is when you centralise decision-making too much, then you need to try and find a solution that everyone's happy with. Now, that's a near impossibility, right? So what is the solution? The solution is you decentralise decision-making to the local level. So that way you can have schools that have teachers that subscribe to their ethos. If another school doesn't want all teachers to subscribe to their ethos, then they have that freedom. But if we decentralise it down to the local level, then we don't need to have one cookie-cutter method that fits everybody. So one thing we are proposing in our Freedom Manifesto for the Liberal Democrats is a voucher system. Right? A lot of places have voucher systems where rather than the funding going directly to the school, you fund the students directly. Right? So what does that do? That means the schools now compete. The schools can serve parents rather than politicians and bureaucrats. So if you think about it now, when the funding goes directly to the school, what is the school's interest? I better please the politician or the bureaucrat, otherwise I won't get my funding. Well, let's take that power away from the politician and bureaucrat. Let's give it to the parent. Let's fund the student instead of the institution. And now parents can decide where their students go. And if the student goes to another school, guess what? The funding goes with it. And it'll make the schools compete. So if a school has teachers that you don't like, for whatever reason, you know, I'm a Christian pastor, but I believe in freedom of religion for Australia. For whatever reason you don't like that school, if you move them to another school, we think the funding should go with the student. So what does that do? That empowers parents and empowers students. The schools and the institutions are then forced to serve the parents and the students rather than politicians and bureaucrats. And I think that's a better solution that will find a solution for everybody. Thank you.
This question is in relation to the digital identity system. So I'll read it out. I called Australia home some 14 years ago. I didn't pay much attention to politics and news, but I'm very much concerned about some recent development in the government digital identity system. I know some countries already have this, and how badly people are affected in terms of privacy on one side and government control on the other side. I want to know whether the leader of your party and your party supports this.
In our Freedom Manifesto, the last point is freedom from You know, we are dead set against these digital identity laws. you know, the right to privacy is something that people take for granted, and just like our other freedoms, you take them for granted until you lose them. You know, in the last 2.5 years, we took the freedom of movement for granted. We took freedom of religion for granted, and we had the right to privacy we took for granted until they wanted to track our every movement. So we're against these digital identity laws because we don't believe the government should surveil us. You know, in our Freedom Manifesto, we say that, hey, if you want to surveil an individual, a warrant would need to be required from a court in order to surveillance an individual. But we want to abolish digital identity laws. We want to abolish any mass surveillance program. We think that Julian Assange should be let free. You know, he blew the whistle on a lot of this, and that's one of our official policies in our Freedom Manifesto. So we are big advocates for the right to privacy. We don't think government should be able to track your every move and track all your transactions. We want to end the cash bans as well. You should be able to purchase something without government knowing. You know, so this is what it means to have a private organisation, privacy. I do believe that it is possible to have electronic transactions to be anonymous. I think with crypto technology that is possible. But do I trust our current politicians and bureaucrats to do it? I don't think so. So I think it's better that we remove the cash bans, remove these digital identity laws, and we protect the right to privacy. You know, I'm a father of 6. You know, one of the reasons why I ran is because I'm concerned about the country that my children are going to grow up in. You know, and I didn't want to look my children in the face when they're older and say, you know, all our freedoms were being taken away and I did nothing about it. So I'm concerned about the sort of Australia that we are going to grow up in. So don't take freedom for granted. You know, you look at other countries that don't have the freedoms we enjoy, but if we let it slip away, we'll only have ourselves to blame. But like I said in the last question, freedom in the law only matters if you have politicians that respect freedom, right? Because we have freedoms in our Constitution. Even if we legislate freedom, if we have politicians that do not respect and honour freedom, then they're going to be at the mercy of whatever the police and the courts are at the mercy of whatever legislation the politicians pass. So really think about that when you choose who to represent you in all levels of government. Thank you.
Thank you, Victor.
Most of us rely on Medicare regularly for our health and well-being, and I can actually say the doctors in Liverpool, at least, and the ones that I go to are great because I haven't paid a gap payment for a long, long time, but that's another thing. And there are also many people in Werriwa that rely on NDIS. If elected, what decisions would you and your party make about Medicare and NDIS? Thank you.
Victor?
Well, this is a federal election coming. For the Liberal Democrats, our priorities are the 10 policies listed in the Freedom Manifesto. So that's what we are committing to when we get elected. I think our party's view on Medicare would be we would just want to keep it the way it is. We don't have any plans on changing anything. But like our policy on decentralised education, I think that is a direction we would want to move. So like I was talking about with schools, it's better if you fund the students rather than the institutions. I would like to see that sort of principle of decentralisation and putting the power to the patient in the same in healthcare. So say, for example, like a lot of you from this area, you know, we go to Liverpool Hospital, you go to your local hospital, and I'm sure if you were to reflect on sometimes your experience at your local hospital, it's not the most ideal, right? But if you choose to go where else are you going to go, right? And that's sometimes how the staff feel, you know, you're not happy, you know, you're taking up a bed, where else are you going to go? Well, sometimes that same attitude happens in schools. And I think if we can move to a more decentralised model where you have more control over how your tax dollars are spent, how your money is spent, then that will force hospitals and healthcare providers to compete and we'll get much better services. Now, in an ideal world, the ideal world that the Liberal Democrats would see is I would defer back to our taxation policies. How does taxation tie into this discussion? Well, if you were taxed less and then you had more choice over how your money was spent, you could choose to go to the providers that you believe bring you value. I mean, I chose as a parent to home birth my children. But do you know that private midwives find it very hard to get into this Medicare clique, right? And it's the same. If you choose more natural ways of remedy, a lot of those options are not available to you in Medicare, right? So if we go back to freedom of choice, free markets where people keep more of their own money and then they can decide what care providers they go to, that will find a solution for everyone and we'll have much better healthcare outcomes. Thank you.
Visit victortay.com.au to learn more and download our Freedom Manifesto, which outlines our 10 policies for the coming federal election. Authorised by Rob Cribb for the Liberal Democrats, Sydney.